Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Ben Piccini. This is the Radical Civility Podcast, and we are a project of Public Square Magazine. Dan, you recently wrote an article for Public Square called, now let me get it right. It's not the roots of, it's exploring, is that right? Exploring liberal and conservative religion. And this just gave me a vocabulary for something that I've been looking for quite a while now, right? I often talk about conservatives and liberals in faith matters. And it doesn't make any sense because I'm not talking about people who voted for Trump or voted for Biden, though there is some overlap. It's something a little bit deeper. It's about like how people worship and how people see scripture and like some deeper stuff. So why don't we start? Do you want to just kind of walk us through what are your kind of main points and what was a summary of that article?
So sure, what I'm bringing forward in the article is not new. Okay. There has been a tension in our faith for a long time between just conservative and liberal ways of viewing faith. Okay. Recently, Terrell Givens published a biography of Eugene England, and he is called by several people, a liberal in the faith, right? Well, what does that mean? We use conservative and liberal to denote political allegiances or political ideology, but that's not what we're exploring here. Sometimes they overlap. In fact, it may be true that often or they usually overlap. That somebody who is just temperamentally conservative is also, conservative politically, but that's not always the case. Sometimes you have people who are conservative by temperament and they bring that to their faith, but they're very liberal in their politics and vice versa. So the fact that you approach your faith one way doesn't mean that you approach your politics the exact same way. But this is a tension, not just in our faith community, but in most faith communities.
So it's not about tax policy. It's not about who you voted for.
No,
it's none of those things.
No, not at all. And so conservative and liberal, as I started out, talking about, okay, how do you define these things? Jonathan Haidt, and for those of you who don't know, he's a what he calls a moral psychologist. He teaches at New York University. He used to teach down the road here at University of Virginia. And then he wrote a blockbuster book, and NYU picked him up. But this book, The Righteous Mind, it goes into conservative and liberal moral intuitions. What does it mean that I have conservative moral intuitions versus liberal ones, right? And he says that conservatives gravitate toward authority, sanctity, and loyalty, right? These three kind of main moral intuitions. And liberals are concerned primarily with care and fairness, or maybe just concerned more with care and fairness than conservatives are. And he says in the book that some of these intuitions manifest in childhood. It's like, some people are kind of wired from childhood with some of these intuitions to some extent. So what does that mean for a faith community? That we have people with kind of different wiring and different temperaments and different ways of thinking about these kinds of things. That's what I try to get at in my article.
And we need to maybe back up a sec, Dan. Another point you make in your article, and that Haidt makes in his book, The Righteous Mind, which Dan introduced me to several years ago, and I've been really grateful for that. It's a great read. I recommend it to everybody. But he points out we have this, it's a little incendiary to say delusion, but I'm going to use that word. We have this delusion that our morality comes from our reason. And not only do we not do that, but it's a good thing we don't do that, is what Haidt says. And I think he's convinced me of that. He has this metaphor of the elephant and the rider on the elephant. And the rider on the elephant is our reason, and the elephant is our moral intuition. And they come from the other. And Haidt points out that people that don't have that elephant are sociopaths, no matter how intelligent they are.
Well, so it's interesting that you say that. So I actually taught a class a little bit about elephant and rider. And one of the points that I made was, you can be a really good rider if the elephant is charging, that the rider has little control. Your job is to hang on and try not to die, right? And the wisdom of the rider is to always recognize that you are merely a rider and the elephant is much more powerful than you are.
And you can sometimes guide that, right?
Yep. And you can improve the safety of the elephant and you can make sure that it's a safer ride. But at the same time, fundamentally, it was interesting. I was debating with a friend about vaccination policy this morning, and what kept striking me was very intelligent friend and somebody I care about too. But I think all of us reach emotional conclusions and then back them with rational reasons as a defense mechanism, not the other way around.
And I think that's where the value of Haidt's work and Dan's exploration here really come in, is that we all do this, but it's useful to be aware of it.
Yes.
I mean, and as Jeff said, it's not a bad thing, but being aware of this allows us, I think, to sympathize more with people who seem to just not be reasoning as well as we think we are, but really just have a whole different set of assumptions.
Because as Dan says, some of these are temperaments. And in psychology, temperament is a special word. You know, it means something that is often heritable. So you got it from your parents, but also very stable, not always. And we'll talk about conversion and changes of heart, hopefully, because that's a hobby horse of all of us. But that is that change, that temperamental consistency is important to consider in here too. These are often very stable kind of ways to approach over a lifetime.
Well, it almost seems like if we're arguing about politics as one example, and I know we're talking about religion here, but you're actually arguing about somebody's personality in the discussion, you're going to hit dead ends. Or let me go to moral matrices, which I think is
one of the reasons we're so defensive.
That's right. That's right. So one of my favorite books about civility is The Three Languages of Politics by Arnold Kling. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's very short, very easy, and I'll give you the spoiler. I don't think he would mind. He gives three examples. He says there's left, there's right, and there's libertarian. And the left is oppressor versus oppressed. That's the language they use. That's how they see the world. The right is barbarian versus civilization. And the libertarian is freedom versus being told what to do. If you want to discuss usefully with other people, you need to use their moral language, not your moral language. So if you were talking to a conservative, you need to talk about it in terms of patriotism, civilization, safety, status quo. If you're talking to somebody who's on the left, you need to talk about compassion and who is being benefited from this, and equity. And it just opens your eyes to, if you aren't, then all you're doing is yelling, no, my personality is a better form, my moral underpinnings, my moral framework is better than your moral framework, instead of making inroads, instead of actually communicating with each other in a meaningful way. All right, well, let's jump into, I have a second question for you, Dan. And this may be a bit of a stretch, but I think that I want to put some bounds on how much this is happening, because I think it's a stretch to say people are political because they're born that way. People are born Democrats or born Republicans. I think that's going too far. But I do think that it's clear, as Jeff pointed out, that some of this is heritable, that a lot of this is much deeper. The other day, somebody asked me about what do I mean by culture war? And all of a sudden I found myself explaining, the last 20 years of history badly. And I started with, in the beginning, there was the Huffington Post. And the Huffington Post understood that, and of course, this is wildly simplified and it's a terrible rendition of history, but I basically said, Huffington Post figured out, and there were many people before then who knew this, but in my lifetime, they were kind of the first big voice that did this. Huffington Post figured out that politics is downstream from culture. That if I can get you to win, if I can get you to convert to me, on deeper cultural issues, then the policy fights are going to fall in line pretty much naturally on their own. And then you had the right respond in similar ways. So you had Breitbart, you had other groups, and all of a sudden you've got a bunch of these on the left and a bunch of these on the right. And that's what we call the culture wars. That was
Breitbart actually helped Ariana Huffington set up Huffington Post. So
I was going to say, so I did not realize this. Breitbart was one of the people who first initially started Huffington Post, which I find fascinating. And it was all this model. It was this idea of if we can talk about the culture in this way, we can impact everything else. I am bringing this back to religion, I promise. And here's how. I think that it's true that politics is downstream from culture, but I think what is downstream from culture? You've got religion, you've got moral underpinnings, you've got worldviews, you've got fundamental values, you've got a bunch of stuff that's way above culture. And that's the thing that I feel like when we talk about conservative and religion, it's never bothered me in a religious setting or in a political setting, because I kind of have always known what we're talking about. But it's that deeper upper, or that stuff that's way upstream even from politics. So is that a fair kind of way to think about this? This is 3 or 4 layers deeper than just who you voted for.
Yeah, I think to some extent, and when we say that these are issues of temperament, we really are not saying that they cannot be transformed by life experiences and stuff like that. The elephant can be steered in different directions. Life is going to give you experiences that if you're open to learning and transformation, the elephant is going to kind of surprise you where it goes, right? And you have some people who grow up with those kind of typically conservative leanings, who discover, just due to life experiences and exposure to different kinds of people, oh my gosh, I have these liberal taste buds too. Haidt uses the metaphor of taste buds. And for some people, it's like it's a shocking experience to discover that they also have liberal taste buds. And because there is a culture war on, they think of this in terms of honor and shame, and like, oh gosh, how are people, I need to fight for these new taste buds now. I need to, I'm a liberal and I need to fight anybody who's not liberal, right? And it turns into just kind of a switching of teams and fighting for a new team and stuff like that. Which is why what Meagan said is important. And I want to drill this word into everybody's heads, awareness, okay? Because those of us who study and practice mindfulness, we believe that just having a non-judgmental awareness of things allows us, it gives us a very different set of resources to engage with different things, right? So, we, in a life of faith, going back to your question, I've kind of gone on a little bit of a tangent here, but going back to your question, Ben, churches develop cultures, right? And in our faith, we have a massive institutional church with wards and stakes that sometimes have kind of their own cultures. And what I talked about loyalty, authority, sanctity, and care and fairness, but there's another 2 interesting cultural dimensions to this discussion, and that is neophilia, which is love of new things, which is typical novelty. Novelty for liberal personalities, and neophobia, which is a preference for things that are not new, things that are established, familiar, tried and true. And that's a typically a conservative trait, right? So we are, as a church, if you get a leader, a local leader or group of leaders of a ward who like things to be tried and true and consistent and are averse to new ideas and changing things, but you're the opposite kind of way in your personality, you're more liberal, you like new approaches to things, new ideas, new ways of teaching and stuff like that, you're going to struggle in that environment, and vice versa, right? If you have never experienced it, there may come a day where you'll see a change in bishop or stake president as Latter-day Saints, and you'll see an immediate change from neophobia to neophilia, or the other way around. And you will see members of the church struggle and start to murmur and complain and say something's wrong. Wait a minute, it was good the way it was. And then we had this leadership change, right? What?
So you're
why?
saying, like, having that awareness that about what's going on, that the differences in those fundamental assumptions means that you can sort of have a little bit, you can hang back and have a little bit of patience and say, I'm reacting a certain way, but that's just reflecting a certain set of assumptions. There's not necessarily anything wrong going on.
Right.
I love that,
right.
Meagan. What I'm hearing you say, so I've started saying this to other people. Imagine a really good institution that's working really well. It's probably going to get it wrong 20% of the time. If you go in with that baked in, it will be a lot less freaky outy when something goes wrong, right? It's like COVID test. My students are always telling me, well, I got tested, I'm negative, it's fine. And I said, what are your symptoms? You can do whatever you want to, right? Like, you do the best you can. Most people assume that COVID tests are like 98% reliable when the number is closer to 70, right? That means about 1 in every 3, right? Like, that's a crazy, crazy low number. In the same way, if you have church leaders that are trying their best and are inspired and are doing everything that they possibly can, they are still going to get it wrong. And if you go in aware that that's going to be the case, I think it's a lot more natural to just go, yeah, that's going to happen. It's not a thing, right? That's the nature of it.
Ben, you had talked about maybe setting some bounds on, like, okay, how changeable is this? And interestingly, one of the things that I recognized when I read The Righteous Mind was that I had undergone that sort of paradigm shift before. So I began conservative and I shifted liberal, and I've actually shifted back since then. And what that's done is kind of bake into my worldview the fact that worldviews shift. So the reason why I think that what Dan's doing is so important is because being aware that it's a matter of perspective, first of all, helps you to understand that there may that your understanding of truth has something to do with perspective. That's not to say that there is no objective truth, but that the way that you see it will be impacted by your perspective. But also, then, if you do undergo some experience that sort of shifts that paradigm, a lot of people start talking like they've been betrayed. like what they understood before was some kind of a lie being perpetrated by the institution or by the people that were sort of part of their tribe before. And because I've kind of gone back and forth, I now know that that's not true, that my perspective has changed, but that there wasn't anything subversive going on.
Yeah. If I could make 2 points about that, and to kind of frame it, if you read Dan's piece, he's not criticizing one or the other, and he's not saying, but he is trying to point out the strengths and weaknesses, or perhaps a better way to put it is the strengths and potential blind spots that each of these temperaments can bring to our worship. So if you think about, Dan did the example of a leader. Well, let's take this into ward, when a leader changes, let's take this into ward council, right? And you're having a discussion, should we extend a calling to a brother or sister that may be less active or maybe controversial, right? And you can imagine a discussion, well, no, we need to protect the primary and things are working well there. Or, well, no, this person needs that experience, right? And what's the right answer? I would suggest if you're having the discussion and it's civil and yet maybe passionate, then you're going to get to the right answer, as Ben says, 80% of the time. And that discussion is healthy. And that those currents that are pulling within that ward council or in other governing councils in the church, then that's good. That's good. You want those in there, and you will, more often than not, if people stay engaged and don't take their toys and go home, or don't get mad, if they stay engaged, you're going to get to the right answer.
There's a professor of mine said something that I love in class. He said, so what am I really teaching you this for? And one of the students raised their hand and said, you're not teaching us for this class. You're teaching us for 5 years from now when we're in the field. This is going to be amazing. And the professor laughed and said, ye of little faith. No, I am not teaching you about that at all. I'm trying to teach you for 1,000,000 years from now. I'm trying to teach you about the people that I want you to become. And you don't have the long-term view. When we're sitting in a ward council having those discussions, it is absolutely the case that I think that God can let us make the mistake, that he can let us have a suboptimal solution, because the conversation and the thinking and the deliberation and all of those things is probably more important and will lead us to get to better answers most of the time. And every once in a while, you can feel the Spirit kind of manifest and be like, oh, wow, we really need to do this thing. But in my experience, that has been the rarity. In my experience, it's much more about the conversation itself. I want to get to your point, Dan, about Jeff, about, I've now gone through everyone. Actually, it was Meagan. Meagan, your point about conversion. I have to share this meme, and I'm trying to find the right one. This is obligatory. You've probably seen this before. So those of you who are listening to the podcast and don't have YouTube, it starts in the middle with liberal, and it's a flow chart.
I haven't seen this before.
It's fantastic. I mean, the longer you look at it, the funnier it becomes. So it says liberal, and then it says started a business, and there's an arrow to libertarian. And then there's an arrow that says has kids, and it goes to conservative. And then the conservative has medical bills and becomes a liberal. And then the liberal starts a business, becomes a libertarian, gets fired, becomes a liberal again. And I think I'm missing one. Oh, the liberal gets mugged and becomes a conservative, and the conservative gets arrested and becomes a libertarian, right? One of my absolute favorite writers, Brandon Sanderson, has a character that is functionally immortal. Okay, and I love this character because, well, it's funny because when I say functionally immortal, it's interesting the way that he writes him, because he says, oh, I'm not immortal. No, there are people much older than me, and I'm going to die someday, but they're billions of years old. I'm only millions of years old. And so you see this like dichotomy.
Is this Hoyd? Who is this? I'm a Brandon.
No, so I'm actually thinking of the bug creature, the creature that's made of Kremlings. So I don't want to give very much away, because I think it's going to be an important plot point, but I will just say this. The people in the books walk up to this creature and basically ask him questions. And it's like, the world is falling apart. You clearly have knowledge. Why aren't you doing something? And he basically says, oh, you're adorable. You think these problems matter in the long term. What really matters is creating a philosophy that will last a long time. And that's where he's kind of settled, is that his goal is to come up with like, a culture factory, basically, something that creates a culture where people can thrive. Two things that have come out of this discussion already for me. One, for a long time, people have always said that culture is something that the church gets wrong. It's not, the church culture is not the same as the church, right? And I would actually argue that it's kind of a bad way of thinking. That is true, that the church sometimes, the culture is not always the correct culture. On that we agree. But I would actually argue that one of the purposes of the church is to create a culture in which people can thrive. And it is absolutely the case that sometimes we get that wrong. But finding that culture is a fundamental part of what churches are supposed to do. Religions contribute to society in kind of a cultural way, a philosophy, a moral framework, a lot of those kinds of things. The second thing that I would say, getting to Meagan's point finally, I think if I walked up to this ancient creature and I said, well, I used to be conservative and then I was libertarian and I'm kind of in the middle, he would pat me on the head and say, that's adorable. You still think of yourself in such quaint terms. Having lived for 1,000,000 years, my mom, when we were in Italy, if she saw a cathedral, she would promise herself to walk through that cathedral. And I said, how can you even remember them all? What's the point? She said, well, it's really easy. I remember one thing that I want to never forget from each cathedral that I go through. What's one thing I'm going to take with me that makes me better for having gone through? And I think thinking of politics in that way, thinking of, or moral frameworks, or whatever you want to call it, and saying, it's not so much that I have shifted and they're the bad guys and I'm now the good guys and I finally figured out who the right tribes are. It's much more about I've become better in this way and I can see through more lenses. Anyway, that was my big long rant.
So kind of going off of that, one of the things that I thought was most important about what Dan wrote is that when we are not aware of the fact that we have a liberal or a conservative framework, we tend to weaponize an idea of God. We sort of use our view starts to inform how we read God, and then how we're arguing with other people through the scriptures, and my God would never do this, or something like that, because when we're not aware of how our perspective is affected, I think that we are not open to allowing God to inform us about what he's like. And so we start making all kinds of assumptions and start using those assumptions to tell other people how they should think and behave.
Well, and it sounds like it's the seed of tribalism too, right? Like there's the conservative Latter-day Saint, and then there's those progressive Latter-day Saints. They're the bad guys, right? Like as soon as you can articulate who you are and who they are, it's us versus them thinking automatically.
You can otherize.
So, yeah, and that's why in the piece I use the word partisan. Partisan means you feel you're part of a party, and there's the other party, and you need to attack them and defend your party, and that's what you're doing. So I just a couple of real life examples from my life in the church. Just a couple of years ago, so after President Nelson became president of the church, immediately there was reform after reform, change after change. Okay, so if you're a conservative leaning member of the church and neophobia is kind of your default trait, characteristic, or stance, I love change in the church. I guess I'm prone to neophilia. Every time the church announces a change, I jump for joy, right? So like severing our ties to scouting, and policy changes, like making the handbook public, and shifting to 2 hours of church and all that stuff. I've just been jumping for joy every time. But I talked with a conservative leaning friend of mine a couple of years ago, and he was not excited about all this. And
It'd be really hard, yeah.
Yeah. He said, are you aware that some members of the ward might really struggle with these things and might be asking themselves, well, what was wrong with the way things were? And they might be in pain over these changes. And it had not, honestly, it had not occurred to me at all that anybody would struggle with these changes. And so I was like, wow, but again, if I were a partisan, I would say, oh, this guy, he's just talking about the bad people, the conservatives in the church, who I need to defeat and humiliate and fight, right? Because we're partisans. But if you approach it from awareness and not partisanship, you can extend compassion, you can extend patience and grace, just a completely different set of resources. When I left on my mission, I think I was more conservative leaning in my faith, right? And we were told to seek out families to teach the gospel to and baptize, right? There were a few people who I met on my mission who I saw like phenomenal evidences of God's power in bringing them into the church, who just did not fit the mold of this is the ideal investigator, the ideal convert. They did not have it all together. They did not, they didn't look like the golden investigator that we sometimes talk about. And after that happened a few times, it really did sink in for me that, God is operating with kind of different lenses than me when he looks at these souls. And I need to cultivate a little more openness. And so again, these things can be transformed. The elephant can turn this way or that way as we go throughout life, and that's not a process that should cause any shame. It's something we should welcome.
Yeah, a bunch of us here are M. Scott Peck fans, despite his personal shortcomings. And one of the points he makes, and I think it's A Road Less Traveled, though I've read just about all of his books, he talks about how the longer he's been in his therapy practice and in Christian ministry, the less able he is to tell who's really going to respond. And those preconceptions, oh, this person is golden, he doesn't use that word, you know, but that idea, or this person's not going to respond, you just don't know. That's something that stuck with me. And Dan, of course, that concept of compassion is another thing you could bring in from a Buddhism and mindfulness that has a bit of a distinct sense to it in those schools of thought. And it makes me think about, you know, if it helps us know where we come from, like someone who that writer has shifted. Like if I think of a conservative religious person, there's someone who knows the price of losing something, right? And Camille Frank Olson, I love her. And she tells this story of this guy in her ward. You know, this is Sunday school. And they're talking about the word of wisdom. And this guy raises his hand and says, we need to talk about energy drinks. That's the juice of the devil. And Camille says, you know, she's tempted to kind of roll her eyes and go, come on, you know, there's bigger fish to fry in the word of wisdom. Well, then she gets to know this person better. And this is a person who's a recent convert to the church and has had profound struggles with addiction, you know, with substance abuse. And he sees that energy drink in the checkout line in the grocery store. And for him, it's a gateway to a relapse. And so he knows what is at stake for him. Right, because he's been in that rock bottom place with an addiction, and he knows what he can lose. And then I would say on the progressive side, you know, this is how I know we had a premortal existence, and it's how I know there was a place of Eden, because in that place we did dwell in this harmony and in this beauty and in this abundance, right? And these are all things that I think the progressive impulse has, right? Well, we can include everybody, and we can have this wonderful unity and harmony, and God's resources are infinite. So of course we have enough to help this person, or to spend financially or effort-wise or attention-wise, whatever it is, right? We have this abundance, and we have this need to include, and all of us have that hunger, right? And we have it because we lived it. We were there, right? And just like we know God exists because people know what is the good and the great. And so I think the progressives feel, maybe they miss Eden more, right? Maybe they miss that sense more than some of the rest of us. And the conservatives, they're going to say, well, what we've got, we don't want to lose either, right?
I wanted to mention, so Jeff, I love this point, not only because you are describing something that I feel really keenly. So when I was in middle school, I found that the hard days were when I had to suspend students. The really hard days were when I had to discipline teachers. But the worst days of all were when I had to meet with my social workers about something that was going on with a student. And on those days, I had to kind of give myself therapy on the car ride home, because I needed to come in fresh for my kids. So no matter what terrible thing had happened in school, I had to be in that place. And one of the only things that I found that would help me is to daydream about a utopian society where this kind of stuff just doesn't happen. I love the idea that maybe progressives just see or miss Eden a little bit more. That we all share a utopian impulse, and they just want it a little bit more quickly, and that there's an urgency there. I think it's a very generous way to see somebody who's on the other side of the aisle. I also wanted to mention that there's something that Jonathan Haidt references, and I don't think he's making the case the way that I will, but he basically said that if you look at the different moral frameworks, conservatives and liberals have all of them, but there are a couple where they have them differently. So for example, with authority, Conservatives will look at authority as primarily a good thing, and liberals will tend to distrust it a little bit more. And in my mind, it kind of made me wonder, okay, so is there an ideal? Because on most of these, he's very agnostic. He's just naming what the different frameworks are. Is there a place where we love our institutions, where we think that it's good to criticize them, but do it carefully, but also to respect them and to honor them and all of those kinds of things, but to do it in a way that is, deliberate. And the example that I would give of this is, you look at somebody who really doesn't like authority, and I'm not going to say 100% because it isn't, but a lot of the time it's because they've learned the hard way that institutions or authority can be abusive.
Yes.
Right. And so I mean, one of the reasons why I give people a lot of grace when they're kind of anti-institutional right now is, if you've come through the 20th century not being skeptical of our institutions, you just haven't learned any history, right? If you come through not seeing the problems government can cause, or the way that powerful people or charismatic people can lie to you or take advantage of you. And so I think that there's kind of this interplay there of how much we trust and how much the institutions deserve our trust. Anyway.
As I was saying, I am very distrustful of change, but that I generally am celebrating when the church makes a change. And I suppose that another difference is that conservatives, I think, are more distrustful of human nature than liberals are.
They're skeptical of it, yeah.
Yes, and that they recognize the limits of human nature. And when I see changes in the church, I don't see human nature. I don't see those changes being based in human nature. I see it as a manifestation of God. And I trust God that when something new comes along, he's not going to leave out the good things from the old stuff. Because I sort of resonate with what Dan was talking about. Like, we're getting rid of scouting. On the one hand, I'm like kind of happy because that's fewer responsibilities for me. But on the other hand, what are we missing? What are we leaving out? And with God, you don't have to make that choice. You can trust that if he's introducing something new, he's not getting rid of whatever was good before. He'll bring it with him.
Well, that was brilliantly made, your point. I'll just add, I was so sad about scouting, not because it's the wrong decision, but because I love scouting. And it's just nostalgia and remembering so many good experiences that I've had. I after this conversation, I think I'm going to say I'm a complete neophiliac on all the changes that I like.
So,
all right.
So go
ahead.
Another point to make, Ben, is these kinds of things, these differences in conservative and liberal tendencies, they apply to different areas of our faith. And something that I mentioned is our epistemology, the way that we figure out what we believe and what we feel comfortable saying that we know. Those are questions of epistemology, and conservatives love authorities when it comes to epistemology. I like to be able to cite this apostle or that, faithful scholar. For me, growing up, it was Bruce R. McConkie and Hugh Nibley. Those were your go-to authorities. And if somebody was, clashing with them, then they were on the wrong side, right? I was kind of partisan in my thinking. But liberals are more skeptical of those kinds of authorities. And they turn to authorities who are academic experts in various fields and stuff like that. So it's not like they go away from authority altogether. They just value different authorities. And
so let me pop in there, because I find this really interesting. I want to distinguish, are you saying that conservatives and liberals have different authority hierarchies, but they all like authority? Because I could see that. And at the same time, I still think I'm trying to articulate where I am on this, because I like citing Hugh Nibley and Bruce R. McConkie. I also like citing scholars And at the end of the day, if they're wrong, then they're all just wrong, and I'm right. And like I don't know where I land on this.
So this is the value of not being partisan in your thinking. This is the value of having, both sets of taste buds. If you can synthesize, church authorities and people who are ordained to speak in the name of God and scripture and these sources of authority with academic authority, where you do value academic methodologies for seeking truth. If you can synthesize these, then fantastic. But a lot of people are just incapable of doing that. They're always going to turn to one or other sets of authorities in epistemology, and that's unfortunate. So anyway, that's another thing that we just need to be aware of. We don't need to shame anybody for for valuing one or the other sources of authority. It's just something to be aware of.
Well, and it gets back to my question of, is there a way that we can integrate and have more of them to build all of the taste buds, to have a more ideal set of moral frameworks? And in my mind, the answer, so part of my answer is this is about triangulation, right? I very much weigh heavily my church leaders. I also weigh heavily the academic research. I also weigh heavily the things that my good friends say, because I trust them and I know their moral intuitions. And I also trust myself and my own ability to think through things. Taking all of those kind of at the same time allows me to feel like I've got some amount of triangulation of what's going on. And I think that gets to this idea of what's the ideal moral framework. I don't know, but it's really inclusive of a lot of these, right? It's got a lot of different places it's coming from.
Well, this morning, as I was kind of thinking about what I would want to talk about in this podcast, I was thinking about where maybe I've gone wrong. And one of the more interesting ways I've gone wrong is, well, there's a philosopher, you maybe know him, Meagan, Condorcet, and he says we know that morality does not come from reason, because you can get 5 very, very intelligent people in the room, and they can come up with 5 different moralities, and they can justify whatever act. And in fact, the problem is, the smarter you are, the better you are at justifying whatever it is you want to do. So, but I think in the church, we have an advantage, which is we have this epistemology, which I think does value knowledge and learning and intelligence in the secular sense and the spiritual sense of that word. At the same time, we have this Christian idea of not thy will, but mine, not my will, but thine. And we have this idea of revelation, and that my thoughts are not your thoughts, and my things are higher. And so some of the most painful mistakes I have made were when I was doing something that was good and right, but that God didn't want me to do, right? If I looked at it with my reason, I'm defending the church, I'm standing up for good things, but those weren't necessarily the things God wanted me doing. And in hindsight, looking back, I stepped into trying to do somebody else's job. And Dan and I talk about this a lot, where our most powerful tool as Latter-day Saints, wanting to help people convert to the truth, right, and bring them to the true and everlasting gospel, is to provide witness testimony. And in this example in my life that I'm thinking about, it was when I strayed off of witness testimony and went into advocacy and debate. And this is hard for me because I'm a high school debater. I competed nationally in debate, so I'm pretty good at it. And the Lord did not want me to do that. He did not ask me to do that, and I got over my skis.
Well, this is somewhat relevant to the title of this podcast. My experience has been that debating. Sometimes we say that the backfire effect is when you debate people, sometimes they dig in deeper. I think that's the wrong way to frame it. Debate is a good tool to ensure that the other side digs in deeper, right? That most of the time, you're going to get people who, unless they are very intellectually honest, which is actually increasingly hard to find, most of the time people who debate just end up digging in. I think it is much easier to see for me that understanding someone else's moral frameworks is a better way to get them to be persuaded in the first place, if all you care about is persuasion. It's
yeah,
also
understanding their moral framework
right.
and then speaking into it.
That's right.
And through it, yeah.
And even if they don't change their mind, you still leave better off because you know them, they trust you. They're like, it just builds something better. And that doesn't mean that there isn't sometimes a time. How do I say this? Sometimes you need to debate because it's everybody else in the room who's listening that needs to hear that you're standing up for something. And I'm not saying
I have
that
a hard time giving up on debate altogether, but that's probably just my emotional attachment.
Yeah, no,
teenage years, but yes,
so
you're right.
I taught my students in the last couple of weeks about the logical fallacies, and then I explicitly told them, you're going to become one of two people: the annoying person that points out everybody else's logical fallacies online, or the person who thinks better because you apply this to yourself. I hope you don't become the first, but I need you to become the second, right? That thinking more clearly, that understanding these moral frameworks and all of that is all of that is the most important part. So Dan, I want to ask you this question. I was a little bit surprised by your definition of liberal, because I was reading and I was like, oh yeah, this makes sense, because politically I'm pretty centrist, right? Increasingly centrist, I should say. I was kind of libertarian for a while, and I have deep feelings about equity and things like that, and immigration. I'm this close to complete open borders anarchy, right? Like I'm hard to categorize. But when it comes to religion, I was like, oh, I'm conservative. This is so much easier for me to articulate now. And then I read your stuff about liberal, and I was like, and I'm also completely liberal. This doesn't work. What is going on here? So will you define for me give me your explanation of liberal, and then maybe I can kind of tussle with you about why I feel like I'm both a religious liberal and a religious conservative.
So liberal, we talked about the intuitions, care and fairness and neophilia, but generally when we talk about liberal and progressive in politics, we're talking about a mindset that we, using the tools of the Enlightenment, like rationality, reason, these kinds of things, are able to make the world the way it should be by applying those tools in favor of outdated tools or less desirable tools like tradition and authority, religion, and culture, and these things that are just based in kind of human nature and lead to backward thinking and stuff like that. So that is kind of the progressive mindset. And it's very appealing to people who are really intellectually gifted, right? Because, hey, I can apply this tool set. The world becomes better when my intellectual tool set is applied to it, right?
Thank you for the compliment. I'll take it.
It's a very validating mindset. And that's why people who are really intellectually gifted, probably most in our day and age they lean liberal. People who are, who go into academia and where they can develop these models and constructs and stuff for making the world the way it should be, right? So anyway, but that is not entirely wrong. We do need to balance tradition and traditional authority and scripture with reason and logic and some of these tools that can draw out, better ways of thinking about these things. So if you have both sets of taste buds, you're just going to be able to see from different angles and value different approaches to scripture and faith and things like that, and you're going to have better outcomes. You're probably going to be less frustrated as time goes on.
So what I'm hearing is it's okay then if I say I am completely conservative and also completely liberal in this context, because I don't think I would say I'm on the left. I think I define progressive kind of the way Jeff does. Progressive is about the utopian instinct. The liberal instinct, I think you nailed it, is the enlightenment, rationality, those kinds of things, the individual dignity of the human. Whereas the left is more about interrupting injustice, challenging our authorities, being skeptical of those things. I'm a lot less of that. There's some in me, but a lot less. But what I'm hearing you say is this is not a forced dichotomy. This is not a spectrum. This is an XY graph where you can be both at the same time in some ways.
So the word for that, Ben, that I bring forward in the article is orthodoxy. Orthodoxy is just saying, so all it means is correct thinking. And every system of thought has its orthodoxy. Science has orthodoxy, and orthodoxy in the context of science is, do you apply the scientific method to produce results that are replicable and objective to whatever extent possible, right? Now, obviously, that's not always achievable, and there's a lot of failures to apply scientific orthodoxy in the field of science. But that is kind of the orthodoxy of science, right? So in our faith, what does orthodoxy mean? Well, what are we promised? We're not promised the same things as science, objective and replicable results. From the beginning of the Restoration, we've been promised the gifts of the Spirit, divinely ordained leadership, God's involvement in the work of the church, connection with our ancestors, and the ability to do redeeming work for our ancestors, all of these kinds of things. So what are the things that we do that result in our belief system, our faith, allowing us to experience those promised outcomes? That is orthodoxy. And so sometimes orthodoxy is going to look conservative. Sometimes it's going to look liberal. It just depends on the situation. And a lot of people are really misguided, I'm going to be blunt here, by looking at the prophets and labeling them as liberal or conservative. When the church came out with its refugee participation effort a few years ago, a lot of people criticized church leadership and said, oh, they're caving to liberals, right? When the church defends traditional views on the family and the family proclamation, a lot of people say, oh, they're just being conservative. It's retrenchment. No, you're projecting when you put those partisan labels on Revelation. Revelation is going to surprise you in different directions, depending on the situation.
In fact, the time we should be most skeptical of Revelation is if it validates our prior.
Yes. If it's always predictable, then we have a problem, right?
Meagan, I think you wrote something on what's the purpose of having a God that always agrees with you. Is that you?
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you are, I do see people, labeling prophets or policies because they are looking at the church through a particular lens. And I think one of the things that we have to expect is that God is he's going to be way bigger than whatever, narrow set of presumptions we are looking at him or the church with. And that's why seeking encounters with God becomes so important. Getting to know him as a real being who exists outside of me, outside of the things that I think about him, is so important, because he is going to surprise you every time. And he should, because if he knows more than I do, if he has something to offer me that would justify my putting my faith in him, then he should be surprising me, and he shouldn't be comfortable. He should not be a comfortable God.
Meagan, you were generous in your formulation, because not having a surprising God is probably one of the core impulses behind idolatry, right? Why do we want to worship dumb idols? Now, dumb doesn't mean stupid, right? It means silent. It means something that won't talk back. But even deeper, it is the formula, right? I think all of us here are familiar with C.S. Lewis's distinction between religion and magic and science and technology, right? And I would say true and living God and idolatry, because idolatry, technology, and magic are all a scheme, a system, a set of formulas that if you follow exactly, right, you will get the same result. Whereas all of those other things are about encountering. It isn't just a formula. It's being open to discovery and either insight and enlightenment in the case of science and knowledge, but in the case of religion, perhaps most importantly, who are we trying to become, right? We are not, the Christian impulse says we aren't what we ought to be yet. And so we are going to strive for that, but we can't do it on our own. And so we have to let God change us, and we have to let God convert us, and we have to let God subtract us. So that's what we need to do.
Let's, I have two last questions that I want to ask really quick. So the first one is, Haidt gives a pretty strong rebuke to rationalism, and as a very liberal, that was hard for me to kind of grapple with.
Haidt is too. He's very open about the fact he himself is quite.
Yeah.
He's moved more centrist, but I think he was a rock-ribbed liberal.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and to be clear, I'm using this again in the sense of rationalism, of divine worth of the individual, of enlightenment, of all of those kinds of things. But he kind of gives rationalism a run for its money. And do you want to talk through that real quick?
Well, the argument he makes is that rationalism is kind of a false god. We think that we arrive at our thoughts and our beliefs through reason, through calculating and these processes that are objective. And he says no, that our thought process actually they follow our intuitions, our feelings, and that's hard medicine for a lot of us to take in, because we like to think that we're in control.
I mean, if you understand the elephant and the rider, then worshiping the rider is silly, right? If you understand that most of the things you were hearing online that sound like they are rational, they are actually just justifications for emotional impulses, all of a sudden that helps you understand, man, we should be really skeptical of a lot of our, beliefs about even skepticism and things like that. I want to bring up one last thing. Jeff Thane has kind of ruined all film for me. I don't know if you all have had this problem with Jeff Thane. I love the man, but I can never again watch a movie because he's poisoned me with seeing expressive individualism everywhere. So he kind of gives me, he gives this presentation where he kind of shows that behind every story is a deeper story. And a lot of those stories are actually preaching really, really deep messages. And it gave me vocabulary for something that I had never really picked up on before. And many of the stories are a very simple story of, I will be happy when I get to be fully expressive of who I am, right? This is every bad Disney Channel movie where at the end, the main character gets to be the captain of the cheer squad and everybody likes her, and that's the end, right? Like that's kind of the plot. So I kind of have noticed that there are a lot of these. So for a talk that I gave in church recently, I was talking about the Family Proclamation. And in preparation for that talk, I went through IMDb's last 20 years of films and looked at the top 100 films. Now, I didn't get a chance to finish. This was very back of the envelope calculations, but I wanted to see how authority in particular was depicted. And what I found was that every single cop was crooked, every father was authoritarian, every family was just, crushing in their guilt and shame. There were no authority figures that came through as decent. Every king was a corrupt tyrant. I think that, again, going back to this idea of the 20th century and how, when you have Hitler and Stalin and Mao all in the same century, there's a good reason why societally we're going to be very, very skeptical of authority. I'm not saying that we're wrong to be. But I think that this is one of the things that I took away from yours, is that religion is still one of those places where authority exists, where hierarchy is not necessarily a bad thing. And let me put it differently. A lot of the breakdowns, we talked a lot about neophilia and neophobia. I think there is some of that, that's real. But I would say that one of the even bigger fault lines when I talk to my progressive friends or when I talk to my more conservative friends, a lot of it boils down to, I'm following the prophet and you're not. Or you're just mindlessly following the prophet and I'm willing to speak up for truth, right? That a lot of the central divide actually breaks down to this deeper story of authority and hierarchy and that kind of worldview. I pretended that's a question. Mostly it was just a rant, and now I want you to say that you agree with me completely.
I agree.
Graciously.
Yeah, and a lot of people who develop conservative, personality traits around authority often transfer those to different partisan allegiances, right? We didn't talk about the social gospel a lot. That's a big chunk of my article, but that's a phenomenon that we see in the social gospel, is in social interactions, is people transferring those kinds of things. And Ben, I want to make sure that I say something before we close here, and that is, I hope that everybody listening understands that in a church context, conservatism and liberalism are tendencies, but think of them as gifts, okay? If you have a conservative ward, a very conservative leaning ward, and a liberal leaning person comes in, they have the ability to infuse that ward with energy and joy and help you turn outward, and they'll probably be oriented towards service projects and getting involved in the community and stuff like that. And a conservative ward that's kind of stale will come back to life as the result of that person's influence. That is a gift, okay? If your ward is liberal and it's chaos, right, then it's a gift to have a conservative person come in and organize and build structure and cohesion so that the ward doesn't completely fall apart and you don't have people just apostatizing all over the place, right? These are gifts. These are complementary gifts. And I hope that we can think of them in those terms.
I think that's brilliant. Jeff, were you going to say something?
No. That's a great summary.
I was going to say, and it's a fabulous note to end on. I remember, I'll share one quick story and then we'll wrap. When I was in Italy growing up, my dad was mission president, and there was no stake. And so, for those of you who know how church ecclesiology works, or ecclesiastical leadership hierarchy works, whatever you call that, he was kind of the boss of all of the district in the area and the branch in the area. And the branch president had tried something new, and I won't go into what it is because it doesn't matter. And I asked my dad, I said, that was weird. Why aren't you going to do something about it? He said, it was weird. And you know what? That's his right to make a weird call. It's not going to hurt anybody. It's not going to damage anybody. And it is more important to me that he know that I support his ability to try something out and get feedback and talk to the Lord about it. I think giving people that grace, I think that this is, here's the other story from that same professor who talked about the million year view. Talked about somebody he knows and how this person is a glass blower, and how pretty consistently in October everybody wants pumpkins. So he said, well, how's the pumpkins going? And he said, well, I've already broken my first 50 pumpkins. And he laughed and he said, well, you mean you haven't sold any of them? He said, no, but the point of the first 50 pumpkins is not to sell them. The point is to make 50 really good mistakes so that on 51 you can start making good pumpkins. I don't think we have enough of a growth mindset around leaders. I don't think we give enough grace. In general, it's a lot harder than sometimes we think. I think I'm also going to leave today with the idea of we all need to grow more taste buds. We need to have more integration across all of these different things to see the different parts as gifts. I really, really love that idea.
Well, maybe I could add a final plea too,
please, yeah.
With the ongoing restoration, right? Or Richard Bushman talks about in Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling, right? The revelation builds upon revelation, and he learned as he went. So long, if I think our choice as members of the church and as just human beings is, are we going to be a part of that or are we not? And if we join that and bring our gifts and also allow others to do that in a compassionate way where we can stay engaged and stay in our covenantal, take our covenants seriously, then we're going to be a part of that. We get to be a part of that, right? If we help our bishop or branch president do some strange new way of ministering or whatever that's in harmony with church principles, but maybe a little weird, even if it fails, we're part of that experience, right? We're part of that process, and that's a really wonderful privilege.
I think that's fantastic. And well, thank you all for being here. This has been fantastic. I am only sorry that we can't talk for another 6 hours because this has been really, really juicy. Before we started, I said normal people like play video games, and that's what I used to do. And now I sit and talk about the moral roots of like liberal and conservative religion, and this has been really, really enjoyable. Would like to have you on all again when we can talk about part 2 and part 3 of your series, Dan. But thank you everyone for being here. And I do want to stress this part. Whenever we close, I always say the opinions expressed are not those of anybody other than the guests. And I have some witty line about how like the point actually isn't even for them to be our ideas. It's that we're supposed to be smarter and wiser in the future, that this is meant to be the best offering that we have in the moment. Patrick Mason talks about theology in this way, where we reason on things because it's our best offering to God. And hopefully it's better in the future than it is today. And I'm really intrigued by that. So thank you all for being here. Go and do some good in the world, and we'll see you next time.